Welcome back to the Credible Dev YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about Proxmox, which is a virtualization platform. We'll be going over how to install it and setting up some VMs on it so you can get familiar with it, maybe try it out on your own. So before we get into that, let's talk about Proxmox itself, and then we'll jump into the install after this. So like I said, Proxmox is a virtualization platform. You can run multiple Proxmox instances or servers on your environment, but one is just fine. That's what I do. Within Proxmox, you can run virtual machines and containers. The containers are similar to Docker, if you're familiar with that. It's based on Q, EMU, and KVM, and LXC for the containers. It's free and open source, so you don't have to pay for it, although there is a paid support option. So if you're running this in a business or some type of enterprise environment, you're probably going to want to consider paying for the enterprise edition. But, it being free, a lot of times companies or businesses might shy away from it and want to go towards something like VMware. But Proxmox is stable. It's used in corporate environments a lot. It's just not as common as far as the ones you hear of, like VMware, ESXi, stuff like that. So you can manage Proxmox through a web UI, which is actually really nice. A lot of these systems don't offer you a front end like a web UI, but Proxmox does. It's easy to use. There's a lot of functionality in it. You can manage your storage or networking in addition to the VMs and the containers. The great thing is the installation of it is very easy. It's very few clicks at all to get it installed and up and running. It's something that you should consider doing if you have any interest in virtualization. Maybe you work in IT and you want to branch out into that side of it. Proxmox is a great way to get familiar with the technology itself, spinning up VMs. If you have more than one machine that you can install it on, you can play around with clusters and migrating VMs from one to the other, that kind of thing. So it's a really cool tool. It's fun to play around with, and you can do a lot with it. So let's go ahead and jump over to the install and show you how that process works. To get ready for this, you will need a USB flash drive, and you're going to need to download the Proxmox ISO. So to get the Proxmox ISO, you're going to head over to proxmox.com. When you get to proxmox.com, you'll see this downloads link. Go ahead and click on that. And you can click on Proxmox Virtual Environment. Click on ISO Images. And you're going to want this one here, the Proxmox BE 7.3 ISO installer. So you'll download this on your machine. Have a USB flash drive handy. You can use anything like Etcher or whatever you want to burn the ISO onto the USB stick. Personally, I use Ventoy because it's a little easier. Once you have it set up, you can just drag ISOs over to the thumb drive, and then they'll be available. They'll be available in a nice menu for you to choose which one that you want to boot. So that's what I'm going to be using, and I will be installing this on actual hardware for this example. I was previously running Hyper-V and Windows for a period of time to test out some things where I'd been on Proxmox before, and now I'm going back to Proxmox. So you're going to be watching me install it on the actual device I'll be using it on, which in this case is a older Core i7 7700K with 32 gigs RAM and a hodgepodge of hard drives that are in it. I don't have like a fancy NAS setup. I don't have a bunch of drives that are all the same size so I could do RAIDs and all these things. I don't have that, and you probably don't either. You might. So this example is very pertinent to just the average user, because this is probably the kind of setup that you're going to have. So let's go ahead and jump over to the actual device, and I'll show you from booting up the USB how to go through the installation process. So here we are at the Ventoy menu, and this is where I'm going to choose the Proxmox. And once I choose Proxmox, we'll go ahead and boot into that ISO, and we'll choose boot into normal mode. And here we have the initial screen. You can use the up and down arrow to choose. You want to choose to install. And we'll go out to a console screen here. And it'll take it just a couple minutes, and then we'll be at the GUI installer. You're not going to have to install this from the command line or anything. Like I said, it's very few clicks to get this installed. It's surprisingly easy. And here we are in the installer. You can read the agreement if you want. Go ahead and click agree. And here, you're going to want to choose your hard disk. Now, whichever hard disk you choose here, you may only have one, you may have multiple. It is going to wipe everything that's on that particular hard disk. If you want to choose a different format like NFS or ZFS, then you can do that through the options. Here, I'm just going to choose one drive out of my machine. And once I hit continue and I go through the process, it'll wipe this. So you want to choose your country and your time zone and keyboard layout, hit next. Here you're going to configure the root password. This is a password that you're going to use to log in to Proxmox in the web interface. You can set up an email here as well. This next screen, you're going to set up your management device. That's going to be your network card. And you can set up a host name, whatever you would like here, and also your IP information. If you needed to set a static IP or make any changes here, you can do that. And then you hit next. And here we're just kind of confirming what we're doing. And we go ahead and hit install. And the install process doesn't take very long, just a couple minutes, maybe depending on the speed of your machine, 3 or 4 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and skip forward in the video to when that is complete. And once it's done, you're going to get the screen telling you how you access the web portal, and then it's automatically going to restart. And after it finishes restarting, you're going to be at a login prompt. Now, of course, you can log in there, but we're going to be moving over to the web interface. And it will remind you again at that login screen what the IP address and port is to access Proxmox on it. So let's go ahead and jump over to the web interface, and then we'll begin configuring it and setting it up, showing you how things work in it. So now what we've done is we've put in the IP address and the port that we were given from Proxmox during the installation into the browser. It's important that you use HTTPS or else it won't work. So once you enter that in, you're probably going to get some type of certificate error. That's fine, because you don't have a certified certificate on your server that your network recognizes. So what you're going to do is, depending on the browser, there's ways to get past this. Firefox, for example, will hit advanced, and then we'll hit accept the risk and continue. So once you've done that, you'll be brought to the Proxmox login screen. This is where you'll use the username root and the password that you set up during the installation. So you enter that in, click login, and now you are at the interface for Proxmox. And you can see here it says you do not have a valid subscription for the server. That's okay and completely normal, because you don't have the enterprise grade. You just have the free license to be able to use it. It's completely fine. It's not illegal or anything. This is normal. So you just click on OK there to get rid of that prompt. And I've already done some initial setup in here as far as doing updates and things. So we'll kind of go over the interface and show you around so you can be a little more familiar with it. So what you have here on the left is your data center, and then you have PVE. Now this PVE is the Proxmox installation that you just did. So if you installed this on multiple servers, then you would have multiple listed here, assuming that you've set up a cluster here, but we're not doing that today. It's kind of out of the scope of what we're doing, and I don't have multiple servers to set it up on anyways. So your data center just encompasses all of the Proxmox virtual environments that you have set up, and we only have one, so it's listed here. Now, inside the data center itself, you can set up a few things. You can set up additional users, so if you don't want to log in as the root user, you want to create additional accounts, you can do that here under users. You can also set up two-factor authentication, which is probably a good idea. You can set up a firewall that kind of covers all of your Proxmox instances. You can also set up storage here, and you can see Proxmox has created two by default. So whatever hard drive you chose, it partitioned it in a way and set up these storage volumes for your Proxmox instance. And we'll be able to add additional to this later. Now, previously, in older versions of Proxmox, you weren't able to put ISOs on the local container or the local volume. You had to have a separate volume for that, or you had to use a USB stick or something like that. In newer versions of Proxmox, you don't have to worry about that. I'll show you how that works as far as how do we get ISOs into Proxmox so we can create VMs from those, like a Ubuntu or Fedora, whatever you want to do, Windows VMs. You're going to need that ISO file to build the VM from. So that's what we'll have here on the local one. And let's go ahead and move on to the summary here. The summary page will just show you the nodes that you have. So like I said, we only have one node, and it shows that it's online and the status is good. You can see some resource information here, such as the CPU, memory, and storage. This does not show all the storage that is available on the host itself. It's just showing what the storage that it was installed on, that Proxmox was installed on. So I chose a fairly small hard disk from this machine to install Proxmox on, but I have multiple other drives and it's not representing those here. And here again, we see the node that we have along with the IP address that belongs to it, the uptime, some CPU and memory usage information, which is the same information that you see over here. We see that we don't have a subscription, which we already talked about. You don't need one to be able to do this. And up here, it shows how many virtual machines and containers that we have running, and we currently don't have any. So let's go ahead and click on our Proxmox one here, and we'll go to the summary of it, and we see a bit different information here. So we see some graphs for the CPU, the server load, memory usage. If you scroll down, you'll see the network traffic as well. You can see the current CPU usage. You can see RAM, hard drive usage, and other information about your server. The shell, this is where you can get dropped into a root shell of the Proxmox server. So in my instance, I have Proxmox installed on a desktop that no longer has a monitor or keyboard and mouse, so I'm not able to, work with it in that kind of way, but I can work with it from this remote shell that the Proxmox Web Interface gives us, which is very handy. But just keep in mind you're a root user here, so be careful what you're doing in this terminal. Make sure you understand what the commands you're running are going to do. You can see that we also have network information here, and we can see that this device has multiple network cards in it. And currently I'm only using the main one that's connected here. But if you wanted to set up VLANs and you wanted to do some more fancy stuff, you can definitely do that with Proxmox. And you can assign these different network interfaces out to different VMs so they're on different networks and things like that. You also have some DNS information that you can configure here, and your time, the system log, so you can kind of see what's going on with the system in case there's any issues. You may be able to find some information here in the syslog. Under updates, when you first install Proxmox, you're definitely going to want to check for updates. And when you come to the screen, it's not going to show anything, but when you click on refresh, it's going to pop up this window here and you see that it's checking for updates. Now, when you first set this up, you're probably going to see some errors in here, and that's because by default, the enterprise repository is enabled. And it's not really a problem, but it's kind of annoying because you're going to see errors in this window here. But the updates, or getting what updates are available, is going to be successful regardless of the error that it shows. So you can go ahead and close this, and if you had any updates, then this window would populate with all the packages. And at that point, to update the packages, you would just click on upgrade here at the top. And like I said, you're definitely going to want to do that when you first set up Proxmox. And the repositories, this is where the additional repositories are. And by default, this one here, this Enterprise Proxmox one, is going to be enabled. And you're probably going to want to disable that because you don't have a subscription, unless, of course, you purchase one. And if you did, then you're going to want to leave it enabled. But you can see I've already disabled it. And to disable it on yours, just highlight it. And this button here will say disable instead of enable. Just click that and it'll turn it off. You can add additional repositories, which I've done. This no subscription one is going to give you updates that are kind of in testing and things like that. So it's not great if to choose the no subscription one if you are running Proxmox in a production environment where uptime and not running into issues is of great importance. You don't want to choose any of these additional ones. But in my case, since I'm just using it at home, it's not super critical that this is up and running all the time. I feel safe with choosing the no subscription one, but you can do what you want here. And you can see I have it enabled here. This is the PVE no subscription. And it warns you that this is not production ready in multiple places. Again, you have a firewall, so you can adjust the firewall on the individual Proxmox instance rather than the overarching data center. And then here we have disk. So if we click on disk, we'll see all the hard drives I was talking about that are actually in this machine. And we were only seeing like 80 something gigabytes on that main screen because it's not taking into account these additional drives. So if you have additional drives, then you may want to create volumes on those so you can run VMs on them. And you have multiple options to do that. Most people are probably just going to create a LVM volume, and that's perfectly fine in most cases. If you have the hardware for it and you have multiple disks, you may want to set up ZFS and create a RAID. It's completely up to you. In this case, we'll just be creating a LVM, which I'll go ahead and do now to show you how that works. So up here at the top, we'll click on create volume group. And you can see it's selected a drive here. I can select different ones and it tells me what size they are, but we'll just stick with this first one here. And we'll give it a name like VM storage 1. And we'll click on create. And that will create a new storage volume. So now we can create VMs on this, or we can create containers on it if we want. The next thing that we need to talk about is how to get the ISOs on here. So to get the ISOs to spin up VMs with, you're going to expand your PVE here and click on local. And you can see here, this particular drive has 39.6 gigabytes, and we've used about half of it. And that's because it already has some ISOs on here. So if you click on ISO images, you can see I have a few different ISO images here that I uploaded just before starting to record this video again. And to add additional ones, you would just click on upload, and then you would select a file from your machine here, an ISO file, and click upload, and it'll send it to the server, and then it'll be here available. You also have container templates. So if you had templates of your own, you could upload them. If you wanted to download them from a website URL, you could do that here. They also have some templates you can just go through here and click and download from the repository here, which is pretty handy. So before we get into actually creating a VM or a container, I think it's important for those who aren't aware the differences between containers and VMs. So like I said before, containers are pretty similar to Docker. They're good when specifically you don't have a lot of RAM on your host Proxmox server. So like mine has 32 gigabytes of RAM. I can run, a few VMs depending on how much RAM they use on this server, and containers use a lot less resources. So if you don't have that much RAM, your system's constrained for resources, then containers are a good option. You can set RAM limits on containers. So instead of saying I want to give 8 gigabytes of RAM to this VM, On a container, you can say, I don't want to allow this container to use more than, 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabytes, or whatever of RAM. It doesn't mean it will use it. It just means that's the upper limit of what the container can use. Containers tend to boot faster than VMs do. And if you have more than one Proxmox node, and in this case we only have one, but if you had multiple, then you're not able to migrate containers from one node to another, which would mean like shifting that container from node 1 to node 2 without being impacted by downtime. So if you had a web server that was running as a container and you needed to shift it to another Proxmox node, that web server is going to have some downtime during that migration. Or with VMs, you don't have that. It can just shift it to another node without creating any downtime for whatever's running on the VM. And containers are virtualization at a software level, where VMs are more at a hardware level. And this is because the container shares the kernel with the host. So in addition to most of the host hardware being exposed to the container, this also means that your containers are all going to be Linux-based, so you're not going to be installing Windows on one of these containers. So if your goal is to create a Windows virtual machine, then you don't want to use a container, you want to use a full VM. And some examples of how people use containers commonly would be the same way you would use a Docker container. So a simple service like a web server, a database, Plex or Jellyfin, and Pi-hole is a great example of how people use containers. Now VMs, on the other hand, they have their own kernel, and they tend to be more resource heavy, and they can run multiple OSs. So if you want to run Linux, Windows, macOS, whatever, for example, you're able to do that with a full VM. If you wanted to set up a SCCM server or Active Directory, VMs are probably going to be a better choice for that. VMs are, like I said, hardware virtualization more so than software. So if you want to expose a GPU that is on your host, then it has to be passed through to the VM. You have to like explicitly do that, because otherwise the virtual machine has no awareness or access to the resources on the host unless you tell it that it can. So hopefully that kind of clears up, the difference between container and VM, and when you might want to use a container and when you might want to use a VM. And for this example, we'll go ahead and create a Linux VM, Manjaro specifically. So we'll click on Create VM. And our node, we only have one. So if you had more than one, you would choose which node you want the VM to be created on. And then the VM ID, that's going to be a unique ID. So for each VM you create, this ID needs to be different. We'll just leave it as the default. And we'll call this Manjaro. We'll go to OS, and this is where we're going to choose the ISO that we're going to install from. And of course, that's on local, the local storage that I showed you earlier that listed all the ISOs. And then we'll select the one that we want to install, and we'll just go with the XFCE one for now. We'll keep this the default. If you choose to install something like Windows, you need to make sure you choose the appropriate option there. On system, we're going to keep everything as the defaults. In a lot of cases, the defaults are perfectly fine, but if you have a specific use case, you might need to make some changes here. Like if you needed to use UEFI, if you need to add a TPM, which is going to be a virtual TPM. So we go ahead and continue here. And this is where we set up the disk. This is going to be the hard drive for the VM. There's a few things that you can edit here. We want to change where it's going to be installed. We created this VM storage 1 a moment ago, and that's where we want to put it. You can put it on this local LVM, but depending on how large the disk was that you installed Proxmox on, the capacity might be limited like it is for me. So I'm going to install it on this one. And then here you can configure the size. We'll just say 40 gigabytes. If this is a SSD, you'll want to consider clicking this discard button. We'll go on to the CPU. We'll give it 4 cores. And the memory, we'll just keep it at the default for now, but you can change this to whatever you want. Next. Here you can completely disable the network device. If you don't want this particular VM to have a network connection, you could just remove it here. You can also select different ones. If you have different devices available, you can do the VLANs. If you have VLANs set up, you can configure the MAC address, and this is going to be the driver basically that's being used for the VM. We'll just leave this as the default. I believe when you install Windows, you probably want to keep it on this E1000 until you have some additional drivers installed in Windows, the virt.io drivers. So we'll keep everything the defaults there, and then we'll click finish. And we'll see the VM pop up here. Now to start the VM, just go to this console tab right here, and you'll see that it's not running. You click start now. And watch it go through the boot process, and you'll be able to interact with it here. So we'll choose to boot with the open source drivers. And that boots us into our install. So just like on a physical machine in front of you, or if you're used to running VMs in VirtualBox or something like that, this is kind of the same thing. So you'd be able to access your VMs from the Proxmox Web UI, or you could install some type of remote software like VNC or XRDP on this Manjaro machine, so then you can access it from another device. You can also create templates, so you could convert this to a template. So if you've set this machine up the way that you wanted, and then maybe you want to spin up more VMs that are just like that one, you can convert it to a template and then use that template to create VMs off of. Or you can just choose clone, which will just straight clone this VM to another VM. You can do a lot of these things with containers as well. And that's got, the templates that you're getting for the containers that I showed you earlier that you can download. That's what they are. They're templates, and then you can spin up containers off of those. So hopefully that gets you started with Proxmox and, how to install it, how it works, to kind of get you familiar with it. If you have any questions about Proxmox, maybe you want to know how to do the GPU pass-through. This particular device does have a GPU on it. I can show you how to do that if you're interested in seeing how that works. Let me know down in the comments. If this video helped you out, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to my channel. I really appreciate it. I hope everybody has a great day, and I'll see you next time.